but the supervised parenting time provider is also contracted by the county DHS to provide foster care placement and adoptions, and they can't seem to think of anything good to say about you in their reports, despite your parents' assessment scores being high from the get-go and just continue to increase with every assessment done. You might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If the caseworker calls 911 the night before your adjudication trial, saying that you're parked outside her house with guns for 10 minutes trying to get you arrested, and the law enforcement determines that you were across town based on overwhelming evidence and conclude that the caseworker was simply mistaken, and yet the caseworker still files to get a restraining order against you because of that and the court grants it, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If your child got removed for no food in the house and the doctor they brought him to diagnosed him with childhood obesity and they still testified in court that you were starving your child, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If you catch the caseworker lying on the stand multiple times in one sitting and the judge still refuses to impeach them, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If you've gone through 5 caseworkers, 4 judges, and the county attorney's office who filed the petition, walked themselves off the plank and had to get a substitute attorney from multiple counties over and still won't dismiss the case, you might be in a child welfare racketeering scheme. If the county attorney calls you combative, delusional, or unaccountable for submitting evidence to the court, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If DHS files a motion to terminate your parental rights the same week you finished your treatment plan, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If your child is placed with someone you've never met, but DHS tells the court it's kinship because they met your ex-boyfriend's mother's daughter-in-law on Facebook, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If your visits are supervised by someone with less child development training than a Walmart greeter, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If the judge keeps ruling in favor of DHS but can't seem to remember your name or your children's names without looking at the file, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If the same county that can't afford reunification services just bought 18 new laptops for paperless documentation, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If the guardian ad litem shows up in court, hasn't spoken to your child in 6 months, and still tells the judge she knows what's in the children's best interests, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If DHS can't define reasonable efforts but uses it like a magic spell to make liability disappear, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If they say your children need permanency, but the permanent foster placement has changed 4 times this year, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If your child's placement provider is on the adoption waiting list, and the GAL just started sending Christmas cards to the caseworker, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If DHS has more acronyms than the Pentagon, but no one can define best interests without using permanency and safety like they're mad libs, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If your caseworker is on the stand to testify and can't think of a single reason why you're an unfit parent other than the fact that you asked your child for a hug once, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If you've spent more time proving your innocence than they've spent proving harm, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If the judge refuses to hear your evidence, but the county attorney gets to share a 45-minute PowerPoint about 3 other people's drug test results and how they somehow constitute evidence that you're on drugs, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If your termination of parental rights hearing begins on a Friday, but the caseworker already told your child that he's going to be getting adopted on Tuesday, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If the same pediatrician DHS forced you to use ran unauthorized blood tests on your kids to check lead levels, but what they really wanted was blood type, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If your caseworker forged your initials to switch doctors, then ghosted when you asked for the release of information, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If you got banned from DHS buildings because you made a YouTube video they didn't like, but your habitual domestic violence convicted baby daddy got unrestricted visitation, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If your child's tooth got extracted without your consent, and when you asked for x-rays, they told you to file a request with your own dentist, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If you have to get a judge's signature to see your own children, but the foster parent just calls them mine and nobody blinks, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If your court-appointed therapist said you're doing amazing work, but the county ignored him because he wasn't on their payroll, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If the DHS supervisor lied to the court about you being violent, then smiled at you in the elevator, feel like y'all are co-workers, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If the judge says, we need to consider the child's best interest, and the next sentence is, we're placing him with someone he's never met, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If your parenting time notes got redacted more than a CIA interrogation transcript, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If your case file has been passed between more counties than a hot potato, and no one knows who's supposed to redact it anymore, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If the DHS attorney sends your confidential case file to someone who isn't even on the case anymore, who then makes fun of you in the email chain and no one apologizes, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If you were threatened with felony charges to coerce a plea deal so they could close your DHS case, then the charges got dropped anyway, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If the people trying to terminate your parental rights all log into court from the same WebEx account, even though they live in different counties, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If the ADA tried to give you a plea deal for child abuse in exchange for returning your kids and called it a generous offer, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If your Section 8 housing is being threatened because your kids got placed with a kinship who rejected their older brother for not being blood related to them, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If your own child told you the caseworker said they're just waiting for the judge to approve the paperwork and I'm getting adopted next week, but you still have your parental rights intact, you might be in a racketeering child welfare scheme. If the caseworker forged your initials, lied about it under oath, and the judge still smiled at her like she just won a Girl Scout badge, you're not just in a racketeering child welfare scheme. You're in a cult where perjury gets you a promotion. If they took your child because you were perceived to be threatening, but gave him to the man who beat you unconscious and is legally banned from being near you, that's not a safety plan. That's state-sponsored hostage exchange. If DHS told the court you refused services, but you had time-stamped emails begging for them and they lost the inbox, you're not in a child protection system. You're in a gaslighting lab experiment run by sociopaths with pensions. If your parenting time reports read like a creative writing workshop, and the only thing they document accurately is the time you walked in, congratulations. You're co-starring in a dystopian fan fiction written by a disgruntled intern with a superiority complex. If the judge calls you emotionally unstable for crying, but the same court lets the kinship foster parent throw a whole temper tantrum on the stand and charge at you as they run out of the courtroom having a full-on mental breakdown, and lets their service providers launder money and commit criminal tax fraud between hearings, you're not being evaluated, you're being ritually humiliated for someone else's quota. If the county says your child deserves permanency, then places them in their fifth home in 4 months, that's not permanency, that's emotional roulette with a trauma chamber twist. If your childless caseworker couldn't name one developmental stage for your child and ignores the fact that they're falling off trampolines, breaking their teeth, getting bruises in the shape of adult fingers all over their bodies, and are coming to visits with entire fingernails missing, but somehow has the authority to declare you unfit. You are not in a court of law. You are in a live action role play of the Salem witch trials, but the wigs are made of ego. If the DHS attorney sends your file to a redactor who isn't even assigned to your case, and she responds with, "Don't give her any ammunition to expose the fact that we've been working hard to prevent her from being able to get her kids back." That's not administrative error. That's pre-crime collusion with a side of state-sanctioned sabotage. If the gal has never met your child, but gives expert testimony anyway and gets thanked for the touch, that's not advocacy. That's judicial cosplay in a kangaroo court with delusions of grandeur. If your child's tooth was removed without your knowledge and they won't give you x-rays, consent forms, or billing record, you're not dealing with healthcare. You're looking at the supply chain of organ commodification with a dentist's mask on. If you're told you're non-compliant for failing to show up to appointments that DHS never even scheduled, that's not miscommunication. That's entrapment by calendar manipulation. If the ADA threatened to slap you with felony charges, unless you pled guilty to a lie, just so DHS could avoid PR embarrassment and evade accountability for the crimes they committed against you, as well as the egregious, irreparable injuries that they inflicted upon you and your children. That's not prosecution. That's judicial extortion dressed up in due process drag. If your own child tells you DHS said he'd be adopted before the termination hearing even started, you're not in a legal process. You're watching child trafficking get notarized in real time. If your court-appointed attorney tells you off record that you're right, then acts like a mannequin during the hearing, you don't have a lawyer. You have a professional chaperone for your own public lynching. If DHS gives foster parents $3,000 a month in stipends, free therapy, case management, legal advice, and a damn Christmas bonus, but tells you you're too poor to parent, you're not in a protection system. You're the raw material in a federally funded adoption cartel.